Hello and welcome back to the Race Anywhere channel for what is part 2 of this mini-series covering Simagic force feedback through SimPro Manager, just looking at what each of these settings is going to translate to in terms of feeling through your wheel to try and help you get a little bit more of a gauge on what force feedback settings you might like to run in future and help you get the most out of your sim racing experience. Now in part 1 we covered steer settings and presets, so go and check that part out. I'll put a link to it or a box somewhere around my face here. And in this part, we're going to be looking at basic settings and vehicle settings. So there's not too much going on here. I'm also going to touch on max torque because it kind of relates to force feedback, or in a weird way doesn't relate in the way that you might think it does. We'll come on to all of that. But that's what we're going to be focusing on in this particular video. And then in part 3, we're going to look at mechanical settings and other effects, but that is for the next one. So, basic settings. Starting at the top with force feedback. Now, if you click the little question mark, you'll realize this is actually the force feedback strength, and it's a percentage between 0% and 100%. Now, this is a Simagic Alpha. It's a 15 Newton meter wheelbase. So by having this at 100%, I'm essentially saying to SimPro Manager, give me what you've got, use whatever you need to out of the 15 Newton meters. Obviously that doesn't mean it's going to give me a constant 15 Newton meters, that's not how force feedback works, but it's giving it the chance to use whatever it needs to give me the feedback I need to get around the circuit. Now if I was to half this to 50%, you're essentially telling the software to give you half of that power, half of that force through the wheel. So an impact that would have been 10 Newton meters of force now becomes 5 Newton meters of force, for example. Now at this stage, I'm going to take a look at the max torque setting because you need to understand the relationship between these two things. The max torque is basically the maximum amount of force that can ever come through in any extreme moment. So for example, when you have a crash, you get a big force feedback spike, the most force that's ever going to come through this wheel is 15 Newton meters. I can lower that, so say I put it to 8 Newton meters, and that means now, if there was ever an impact that's giving a signal beyond 8 Newton meters, it's going to cap it. I'm never ever going to get anything stronger. So this is basically, I guess you could say, a safety feature, you know. I, in a crash, can cope with 15 Newton meters. I wouldn't want to cope with any more, but 15 is fine. I know to take my hands off the wheel, so I'm going to leave that full. Now, if I was running this force feedback setting low, obviously I'm very unlikely to ever reach 15 Newton meters. Even in a big incident, I might now only get 10 Newton meters, for example. But it just gives you the headroom to allow you to experience that if that situation requires it. So think of it as headroom. The best way to explain this is look at max torque as the maximum possible amount. Look at the force feedback percentage in very simplified terms as an average. So if I like 7.5 Newton meters out of 15, if I feel like that's around about the right weight in most situations, set it to 50% and you'll be fine. If I am someone who's a bit stronger, if I like a bit more feeling, a bit more weightiness in my steering, I'm going to set that higher, maybe around about 80%. Now I did say in this series I'm going to focus very much on the actual feeling that you get as a racing driver through the wheel. So if you have this as a very low setting, you're essentially going to get a very lightweight steering wheel. You're not going to feel anything in too much detail. You're going to know that something's happening, but it's not going to make much of an impact. Whereas if I set this to 100%, it's going to feel like the wheel is trying to drive you almost. You're going to feel every bump, every curb. It's going to be very heavy through certain corners. And it's all about finding the compromise that works for you. I like to feel like I've got some control over the car. I don't want to feel like the car is fully driving me. So I tend to not try and run at an average, let's say, of 15 Newton meters. I would tend to run something around about 80%. But it's not quite that simple. What I actually do is in the software, the SimPro Manager software, I'll set this to 100%, and I'm going to turn down the force feedback strength in the individual game that I'm playing. Now the simplified explanation for this is that if you max out the in-game force feedback strength setting, you risk losing some of the higher load detail and fidelity, because the game is essentially straining to give you as much power as possible. It's a bit like how if you're listening to music and you turn your speaker up too loud, the sound will become a bit messy and you won't hear the intricacies. So by turning down the strength in-game rather than in the SimPro Manager, you're making sure that the force feedback signal from the game to the software is as clean as possible. The reality is you're not going to notice much difference in any normal situation between having, your software at 80 and your game at 100 or vice versa. But when it comes to the finer details and the clipping, there is a chance it will make a difference, which is why I tend to go down this route. So the big one's out the way, let's move on. First of all, reverse force feedback. Now this is really simple. The only games I've ever experienced this with are R Factor 2 and Le Mans Ultimate, but for some reason, the game reverses the force feedback effects. So instead of giving you forces in one direction, it actually gives you forces in the opposite direction, and it can actually be quite dangerous when you first launch the game if you don't expect it. The wheel actually turns with you rather than against you. So that setting is literally just for those games. You'll feel it if it's really, really wrong. If it feels like the wheel is accelerating when you turn it, all you need to do is come in here, tick that box. So for my LMU presets, for example, I have that box ticked. You can also do this in-game, so make sure you do one but not the other, if that makes sense. It doesn't matter which way you go about it, but that's why that's there. Very, very simple. You won't need to touch it on most occasions. The other basic setting is smoothness. So this is where we finally start getting into the feeling of the steering and the actual details within the force feedback. And the smoothness bar is exactly what you would expect, really. It's adjusting how smooth everything feels with regards to force feedback on a scale between 0 and 10. Now, if I set this to 10, it feels almost like I'm steering a car underwater, right? Everything's very soft and cushioned. You don't get a lot of weight in the steering wheel. It's different to just turning down the force feedback. It just feels a lot more numb and muted is the best way I can describe it. So you're really not going to be able to drive the car too well, but you are going to have certain instances where you still get a bit of strength through. Now, if I was to set this to 0, it's going to feel like I'm driving a go-kart through a quarry. It feels kind of like the equivalent to having no suspension. You know, there's absolutely no filtering. Everything that's happening in terms of the physics is what you feel. So with smoothness on 0, you're going to feel every single bump, every single curve, every single vibration in full detail. The game is not doing anything, or the software, I should say, is not doing anything to try and smoothen off the edges, if that makes sense. And for me, it's a little bit too raw of an experience. Yes, it's probably the most correct in terms of the data, but it just feels a bit too extreme. So what I tend to find with Le Mans Ultimate specifically, I'll run this actually as high as 4 because there's so much detail coming through in the force feedback from a game like that. I actually prefer a slightly more comfortable, smoother experience, so I'll run it up at 4. Any higher than that and you begin to lose some of the detail that you really want. And if you're someone who, you know, wants to get as much detail as possible, wants to know everything about what's going on at the expense of comfort, feel free to turn this off or run it really, really low. On something like iRacing, I'm perfectly comfortable running this 2 or 3. Now, onto the vehicle settings, we have wheel rotation speed, which is an interesting one. This is a parameter from 0 to 100. Now, if you click on the little question mark, you can see if you have it set to 100, what it says is it allows for maximum rotation speed. So that's the speed that the steering wheel rotates in any given situation under force feedback load. Now, there's a very important thing to note there. 100% allows for maximum rotation speed. It doesn't force maximum rotation speed. So what's interesting about this one, if I was to set this to 0, the wheel would feel very lethargic. I mean, you can see it right now. It feels heavy, it feels slow, because it's not wanting me to steer any faster than that. It's kind of applying its own speed limiter almost. If I set that to 100, it's very light and very easy to turn. Now, the default presets from Simagic, which can be accessed here in the presets menu for most of these games, sit around about 20 or 30 wheel rotation speed. Now, the thing I found interesting when I was testing this, when I changed from 30 to 100, I barely noticed a difference in the feeling, whereas when I changed from 30 to 0, I noticed a massive difference. And that's because all it's doing is giving you headroom to allow for higher rotation speeds when the data requests it. So by running this at 100, it's not like it's actually going to mean that every time you turn the wheel, everything's going to be quicker and reactions are going to be quicker and things are going to snap on you. It just allows for that to happen in a situation where it could. So I'd be perfectly happy racing on something near 100 here, but when it did go wrong, when things were going to rotate, it would snap very, very quickly. Essentially what I'm saying, don't run it too low, because that is actually going to affect things when you're driving. If you set this to 0, it's going to become very lethargic and slow. But just make sure it's high enough that it's higher than whatever the normal steering input feels like. So I would probably run this anywhere between 30 and 60, for example. Worth noting on this one, this setting is probably going to be a lot more important when it comes to stuff like drifting, because I can imagine the wheel rotation speed allowances are far more crucial in drifting. You probably need to allow a faster speed, or maybe you need to cap it to stop it being too fast. That's where my expertise falls on its face. So just worth playing around with if you're into drifting. The final bit for this video is feedback detail. Now, this is a scale between 0 and 20, and if you look at the little description, it enhances the force feedback from the road surface and vehicle suspension. So having this at a higher number gives you more detail in theory, but it also may increase noise and heat while driving. So essentially, the motor's having to work a lot harder to give you more detailed inputs and essentially deliver more information quicker. So if you're struggling with your wheelbase overheating or anything like that, you're doing long stints, that's maybe a reason to not run this full. But I have to say, in my personal experience, and I've not had this base for too long, so it's not a huge amount of experience, but I've never noticed any heat issues or anything like that. So I can run this fairly high. Now it's interesting, you do really feel a difference between 0 and 20 with feedback detail, but it's more noticeable when you turn smoothness to 0, because that's the best way to test things. It's not doing any damping for you, for example. So when I was playing Le Mans Ultimate, when I had feedback detail down at 0, it kind of felt like the bumpy road surface was a kind of generic bumpy road surface. It didn't feel like I was getting the feeling from every single specific bump I was driving over. Whereas when I set it to 20, I really did feel like every single little bump in the road, every change was translated through the wheelbase. And it wasn't a massive difference, I'll be honest, but enough for me to go, okay, I can feel the difference there. I like having a lot of detail, but do I need it? Not really. So it kind of comes down to how hot is your base getting. Other circumstances, of course, other variables will affect things like that, and I can understand why they've put that in there. But if that's not a compromise for you, it just comes down to what you like the feel of. Some people might actually prefer just a slightly more generic feeling bumpy surface rather than trying to feel every single little thing. I did notice with the other game I was testing, iRacing, that you actually feel the difference between 0 and 20 less, and I think that's down to the fidelity and the frequency of the force feedback data that you're receiving. So on Le Mans Ultimate, you're getting lots and lots of force feedback data very quickly. It's like 4K force feedback, whereas iRacing's still feels really, really good, but it's coming at you less quickly. It's almost like, I guess I'm trying to visualize this for you, but it's like 1080p force feedback rather than 4K, and therefore the difference between maximum and minimum is smaller, so you don't necessarily feel it as much. That's what I found in my experience. It might be different for you, of course, but basically anywhere between 0 and 20, it wasn't going to massively influence anything. I tend to find, though, without the heat issues, I'm going to leave this around about 14, run it quite high, and if I do encounter any problems, I'll let you know, but so far, all is fine. And that's going to be it for this video. Hopefully you found this useful, and of course make sure you check out part 1 if you want to learn more about steer settings and presets, or part 3 coming in the future to learn about mechanical settings and also some of the other effects that are available through the software. Leave us a like if you're finding this series useful. Let us know down in the comments below your thoughts, and of course subscribe to the Race Anywhere channel so you don't miss any future updates. But until I see you next time, thanks for watching and have a great week.